Okay, this is an overview of muscle tissues and skeletal muscle. So there are three different types of muscle tissue. First, you have smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and then skeletal muscle. This is a picture of smooth muscle. You can find it mostly in the circulatory system, which moves the blood through the blood vessels. Then you have the cardiac muscle, which is found in the heart. And then our skeletal muscle, which covers our bones and mainly used for movement. So all muscles can display excitability by changing its electrical state from polarized to depolarized. The action potential electrocutes the membrane of the muscle tissue. Therefore, the nervous system plays a big part in the function of skeletal muscle, resulting in movement and energy. And this is a diagram of how action potential works. It needs the different ions, such as sodium ions and calcium ions, to contract and relax the muscle. Contraction or contractibility of the muscle happens when the action potential in the the actin proteins and the myosin proteins pull together. The calcium ions activate the enzymes, then these enzymes activate the myosin heads. ATP is also needed to complete this process. Muscle tissue also allows extensibility and elasticity, helping the muscle to strengthen and relax. Here we have the skeleton muscle structure. Our muscles are wrapped in connective tissue called the epimysium. Inside the epimysium, you have the muscle fascials. Inside the muscle fascials, you can find the muscle fibers, which are covered by the perimysium and the endomysium. That brings us to the inside of the muscle fibers. And the muscle fibers are also called muscle cells, and they contain the sarcolemma. So the sarcolemma is found along the entire muscle fiber. This is where the sarcoplasmic reticulum stores, releases, and takes in the calcium ions that are needed to excite the muscle. The sarcolemma also contains the sarcomere. The sarcomere contains everything responsible for the muscle function. The actin filaments, which are the thin lines, and the myosin filaments, which are the thicker lines. They are arranged to pull together along their sarcomere, and that is what allows contraction and relaxation of the muscle.
Hi, my name is Courtney Leonard, and I will be presenting muscle fiber concentration and relaxation. The basic structure of a muscle cell is where you have the actin and myosin acting together, causing an sparked action for our daily motion. Also, we have myofibers, which are the parallel threads squashed together to form muscle fibers. They include mitochondria, multiple nuclei, and sarcomere, as well as vesicles, which are large structure bundles formed from muscle fibers. Now, when we start talking about the relaxation and concentration, we also have to talk about the rules of protein. Now, two rules for protein is when they bind to things, they change shape. Also, they allow proteins to bind and unbind to other stuff. But we have to include the structure of a sarcomere, which are actin are thin filaments, and then myosin, which are thick filaments. And muscle is all about the sarcomere contracting, bringing the Z lines together. It also has a repeating pattern overlapping the filaments. And when the muscles are at rest, actin and myosin strands do not touch, but they really, really want to. How does this work? During muscle contraction, the two ends of the sarcomere come closer together and the thin filaments slide past the thick filaments. But before that, the brain sends an action potential along the motor neuron until it synapses with the muscle cell. The receptors of a muscle cell are ligated gated sodium channels, so when the motor neuron releases acetylcholine into the synapses, channels open up, create a rush of sodium to the cell as a gated potential. And then we'll have the actin is blocked by proteins called the tropomyosin and the troponin, but can be triggered by ATP and calcium. So the action potential travels along the sarcolemma where the T tubules are located deep inside. This triggers the voltage sensitive proteins that are linked to the calcium channels on the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Calcium ions start to bind to the troponin, allowing the tropomyosin to pull away from the action strands. Then the myosin that is binding to the new sites have ATP attached and will be broken down into ADP and phosphate. And those allow for an extended position to happen, like you're stretching your arm. Then the whole sarcomere shrinks and contracts. So muscle cells have a sarcoplasmic reticulum walls that are loaded with calcium pumps, where ATP is used to save up tons of calcium ions, and is studied with calcium channels that are linked to the voltage sensitive proteins. And this entire cycle continues to happen over and over as our muscles contract and relax. Hi, my name is Courtney Leonard, and I will be presenting nervous system control of muscle tension. When we talk about muscle tension, it is the force generated by the contraction of muscles, which also is seen as the shortening of the sarcomeres, which we talked about during the contraction and relaxation last section. So there are two types, isotonic and isometric. Isotonic is the muscle contraction that involves changes in the muscle length. Isotonic is the opposite, in where it's the contraction that occurs with no change in the muscle length. And as you can see in the chart next to us, we have two types of isotonic contractions. We have concentric and eccentric. So concentric is where we will see the muscles shortening to move a load. So like he's using his biceps to lift this weight, and the muscles are being brought upward, increasing that tension. And then we have eccentric, where it happens where the muscle tension is diminished and the muscle is lengthened. As he is bringing this weight back down, the muscles are elongating. And then with isometric, a good example is the change is not happening. So he is trying to lift the weight, but the joint in which the elbow and the ankle is not moving at all. So then we have our motor units. They are very great at controlling how much we use and how little we use. So with the motor unit, it is basically a motor neuron in the group of muscle fibers it innervates. So with that, you can have a big motor unit or a small one. The small one is great for permitting fine motor skills or fine motor control, which is the movement of our eyeballs. And the large ones are basically concerned with gross movements, so powerfully extending the knee joint when needed, as you can see the man doing a wonderful backflip here. Then we have requirement, which is the increase in the number of motor units involved in contraction. So with that, recruitment is you have your neurons that are being recruited to make that contraction a lot stronger when it's needed. And so the nervous system really uses this when they are trying to utilize the skeletal muscles and prevent muscle fatigue. And then we have a twitch, which is a single contraction produced by one action potential, which is measured by a myograph, as you see the graph in the video. There are three phases: the lengthening period, the contraction period, and the relaxation phase. Now, with the lengthening period, this is where the action potential is being propagated along the sacroilium and calcium ions are released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And this was what helps with our excitement and our contraction during certain movements. And then we have our contraction phase, which is where our calcium ions in the sarcoplasm have bound to the troponin, and the tropomyosin has shifted away from the actin binding sites. So then we have our cross bridges that are being formed. Our sarcomeres are actually shortening to the point where they are reaching its peak potential. And then the last phase is going to be our relaxation phase. So during this phase, this is where the muscle tension should decrease as the contraction stops. And so our calcium ions are pumped out of the sarcoplasm into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the cross bridges and their cycling begins to die down, and the returning of the muscle fibers are going back to their resting stage. And this will bring everything in the rate at which our motor neuron fires its action potential and how it affects the muscle tension being produced. To help with our muscle tension, we have what's called a graded muscle response, which is basically the modification of the strength of the muscle. So it's the rate at which the motor neuron fires the action potential, like I said before. But this also leads to what's called the wave summation. So the addition of successive neural stimuli to produce a graded concentration. That can lead to what is called tetanus. So it's a continuous fused contraction. So that's how we get locked jaw, difficulty swallowing, shortness of breath, things of that. Because as you see the wave summation, we go in waves of how our muscle moves. But then tetanus and the tension, it spikes up, has to maintain its peak, and then drops down very quickly. So our muscles are not able to tense or relax like they need to. And then we have what is called muscle tone. So with muscle tones, we have low concentration of the muscle contraction that occurs within the muscle fibers and is not producing movement. So we have two types. We have hypertonia and we have hypotonia. So as you can see down both sides, so hyper, you got stiff limbs, difficulty moving, muscle spasms, which a lot of us have and it occurs. And then hypotonia, we have floppy limbs, we have difficulty standing, and instability. And so with muscle tone, the hypotonia, we have low levels of contraction that are happening. And then with the hypertonia, we have excess reflex responses that are happening. So with the hyper, and that's why we have a lot of our muscle spasms, we having our reflexes are firing off with those action potentials during the motor neuron, and that's what's bringing this muscle tone to overact and stimulate than what we really, really need.
All right. First up, we have types of muscle fibers. There's three different types of muscle fibers. There's going to be slow oxidative muscle fibers, fast oxidative muscle fibers, and fast glycolytic muscle fibers. Your slow oxidative muscle fibers are going to be in charge of your posture, other small movements that require very little ATP. Your fast oxidative fibers are going to be in charge of things like walking and other activities that use a little bit more ATP, but not a whole lot more. And then your fast glycolytic fibers are going to be in charge of your muscles that are used during sprinting, weightlifting, other activities that require a lot of ATP for short amount of time. All right, how to tell if something's oxidative or glycolytic. So obviously there's two that are oxidative and one that's glycolytic, and this is determined based off of the metabolic pathways that's used. So if it produces ATP by an aerobic or anaerobic method, that's how it's told. So, if it produces ATP with an aerobic way, then it's oxidative. If it uses an anaerobic way to produce ATP, then it's going to be glycolytic. Slow oxidative fibers produce more ATP at a slower rate than the fast oxidative fibers, and then the fast glycolytic fibers produce ATP the fastest out of the three of them. Next up is myoglobin, and this is just used to get oxygen to the mitochondria, which allows more ATP to be made faster. So obviously that helps out with everything in the muscles. Also, the amount of myoglobin in each muscle fiber determines its color. So if it has a lot, like the slow oxidative fibers, then it's going to be more red, whereas the fast oxidative are more of a pink color because they don't have as much myoglobin, and the fast glycolytic they have practically none, so they're white. That's how you can tell the difference between the myoglobin. Also, in muscle cells, typically you see all three different types in one muscle cell, and the proportions are just determined based on what exactly the muscle is used for. So what kind of muscle fibers it'll need. All right, next up we have exercise and muscle performance. Three main terms when talking about exercise and muscle performance are going to be hypertrophy, atrophy, and sarcopenia. So hypertrophy is the growth of muscle mass through added structural proteins. You can see it here demonstrated by this bodybuilder. He has more mass because he's trained to put that extra weight on. So the muscle cells themselves don't actually grow, they just change shape, and they start holding all those extra structural proteins, which actually makes them bigger. In terms of atrophy, it's the exact opposite of hypertrophy. So it's going to be the shrinkage or loss of muscle mass, or loss of those structural proteins through not using the muscles. So you'll typically see this in people that are in wheelchairs. Their legs will look a lot smaller than the average person who's walking around using these muscles day to day. There's also sarcopenia, which is going to be muscle atrophy, just due to growing older. It's just a natural thing that happens. So you see here's your normal or average younger person that has these proportions of muscle to fat, whereas as you get older you're going to have less muscle and more fat, and that's just a natural thing that happens. Let me see here. Okay, so there's two different kinds of exercise. There's going to be endurance exercise and resistance exercise. So first up, endurance exercise. So training for endurance will develop capillary networks, which are going to provide more oxygen to these muscle fibers so that they can get ATP produced and allow them to work for longer periods of time. So like a marathon runner is going to need a lot of ATP over that long course of running. It also helps get the metabolic waste out of the way so they don't have to worry about that. Typically, these long distance runners, this is a perfect example, they don't have a whole lot of muscle growth. So you can see these guys are a little bit smaller, but they're all lean muscles. So you can see all the definition in this guy's leg right here. I mean, as opposed to a bodybuilder who's just going to maybe be a little bit more bulky because he's trying to put weight on instead of, do 100 reps of squats, So that's the difference between those two. Excessive endurance training can result in overuse injuries, such as shin splints is a big one that you'll see in runners, where that tendon and that bone just starts to just pull apart because of that constant repetition, and it's not necessarily good for your body. The other one I talked about, resistance exercise. You'll see here, this is a perfect example, Ronnie Coleman, a huge bodybuilder. This type of exercise requires more ATP, but it's just a quick, powerful movement. So like a clean and jerk or a squat or a bench, just quick, powerful movements. So this type of exercise increases the amount of myofibrils, which causes hypertrophy. So it causes those muscles to grow. They have no choice but to get bigger. And this requires these athletes to ingest more protein than the average person because their muscles are growing and they have the extra protein in their body, so they need to feed it, to help out with that. In order for someone's mass to go up, they need to keep increasing weight. So if one person's squatting a 45-pound bar for a year, they're not going to get nearly as much muscle growth as someone who's going up 10 pounds every 2 weeks and constantly making those muscles stronger and bigger. Also, improper use of this training can result in injuries just like the other one, except these are a little bit different. You'll have result in tendon and skeletal damage. Ronnie Coleman, again, a perfect example. This guy went from squatting 800 pounds to now he can barely walk because he was squatting too much. All right, next up we have performance-enhancing substances. Two main ones are going to be anabolic steroids and HGH, otherwise known as human growth hormone. Anabolic steroids increase levels of testosterone, which promotes muscle growth. This is usually going to be used by bodybuilders. You'll see it's what makes them really big. One of the negative side effects, obviously, is that since it produces testosterone, now the testicles don't have to, so they'll stop, and then you'll have negative side effects from that. HGH can also be used to build muscle mass, but it's mostly just used for recovery because, the faster you can recover, the faster you can get back out there and do those things that are going to keep building your muscles and getting you conditioned to perform at your best ability. So those are the two main ones. There's also creatine. There's been studies on it to see if it actually does help you. It's not really known yet, but what it's supposed to do is get more ATP to the muscle so that you can have stronger contractions. It's supposed to help you out during the workout. More ATP, more energy, the better your muscles can work. Next up, we have the cardiac muscle tissue. This is going to only be found in the heart. It's shorter than the skeletal muscle tissue, and it usually only contains one nucleus, whereas the skeletal muscle tissue contains multiple nuclei so that it can, keep reproducing those muscle cells for whenever they get torn and they need to repair themselves so that they can keep growing and getting bigger. The cardiac muscle cells are connected by these intercalated discs you can see here in this picture. They allow the heart to contract in a wave-like pattern so that the heart can slowly, get all that momentum to push all of the blood out and flow it through the body so it can really work as a pump. Two main things that you need to know are the gap junctions and the desmosomes. Gap junctions are basically just holes that connect adjacent muscle tissues and fibers together, and they allow the flow of depolarization from one muscle cell to another. So this allows the electric signals to send from one muscle fiber to another to allow the heart to work as one whole one whole muscle instead of 1,000 different muscle fibers. The desmosomes are the structures that hold the cardiac muscle in place. Here's two examples. This is the gap junction. This is the desmosomes that are holding this cardiac muscle in place. This just prevents it from ripping apart as the heart is actually contracting. How is the heart controlled? It's going to be controlled by a pacemaker, and the pacemaker is going to be controlled by the automatic nervous system. So this actually isn't a conscious thing. You're not thinking of pumping your heart. You can't even change it by thinking about pumping your heart. It has a feature called autorhythmicity, meaning it can depolarize all the way to its starting point and fire all the way up to the highest point all by itself. It doesn't have to be controlled by signals getting sent from your brain to do all that stuff, which is pretty cool. It gets to do its own thing. It can also be regulated by hormones. Can change the speed of your heart.
Smooth muscle fibers are spindle-shaped and have a single nucleus. They produce their own connective tissue called endomysium. The fibers in the smooth muscle group branch together like bundles, which allow for the cells to contract, much stronger than those of striated muscles. Smooth muscles can be found in the walls of hollow organs, passageways, tracts, as well as your eyes and your skin. The shape of smooth muscle cells and their nuclei vary depending on whether the muscle is relaxed or contracting. The actin containing thin filaments found in the cytoplasm of smooth muscle cells anchor to the sacroplasm via dense bodies. While the primary function of smooth muscles is contraction, Smooth muscles consist of two types, the single unit and multi-unit. A single unit smooth muscle consists of multiple cells connected through connexins that become stimulated in a synchronous pattern. Multi-unit smooth muscles receive its own synaptic input, allowing for the multi-unit smooth muscles to have much finer control. So the single unit smooth muscle works together as one unit, while the multi-unit smooth muscle can act and function independent of the other units. Some of the basic functions of smooth muscles will be the regulation of blood flow and pressure in the cardiovascular system. It regulates your urine flow. It can raise the hairs with the erectile pillow muscle, and it also dilates and constricts the pupils. During the embryonic development, hundreds of myoblasts fuse until they create a mature muscle cell. Numerous satellite cells found in skeletal muscles are stimulated to divide when the muscle is damaged. After dividing, the cells fuse with existing muscle fibers to regenerate and repair the damaged fibers. Since skeletal muscles themselves cannot divide, muscle fibers lay down new protein and enlarge, which is called hypertrophy. Cardiac muscles can also hypertrophy, but since there are no satellite cells as found in skeletal muscles, when cardiac muscles die, they are not replaced. Instead, they are replaced by scar tissue, which cannot contract. Smooth cells have the greatest capacity to regenerate of all the muscle cell types. The smooth muscle cells themselves retain the ability to divide, which allows them to increase in number. New cells can be produced by the division of cells called periocytes that lie along some small blood vessels, which also allows the smooth muscle to hypertrophy. They also regenerate and repair much more readily than skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue.
Hello everyone. Tonight I'm here to talk to you about nervous system. The nervous system consists of two major regions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is made up of the nerves throughout the body. The nervous system is what allows our body to walk, talk, breathe, swallow, and do almost anything. The peripheral nervous system can be further broken down into the somatic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. Now we'll move on to nervous tissue cells. There are two major types of cells in the nervous tissue, neurons and glial cells. Neurons are what is responsible for receiving signals input from the external world, sending motor commands to our muscles, and for transforming and relaying electrical signals every step in between. Then we have glial cells. They do not produce chemical responses like the neurons do. They help maintain homeostasis in the body and provide support and protection to the neurons. There are different types of glial cells as well, satellite cells, Schwann cells, and astrocytes, and they all have different jobs. Last but not least, we have the function of the nervous system. Then we have integration, which controls and helps communicate the info throughout our body. Like once our body starts to realize, hey, this water's too hot, it starts to initiate the response. Lastly is the response, which is when our nervous system tells our muscles, hey, you need to move your hand away quickly. Thank you for watching.
Hello, my name is Quasi-Linear, and this is my PowerPoint on sections 12.4 through 12.5, potential and communication between neurons. So this is a diagram of our nucleus and the inner parts of it as well. So the action potential between cells. The nucleus of an atom contains protons and neutrons. So the central nervous system, known as CNS, is the part of the nervous system consisting primarily of the brain and spinal cord. The CNS is so named because the brain interrogates the received information and coordinates and influences the activity of all parts of the bodies. as well as the action potential. In the PNS, a cluster of neuron cell bodies is referred to as a ganglion. As for a bundle of axons or fibers found in the CNS is called a tract. As well, it consists of a large nerve running from the anterior to the posterior, with the anterior end is enlarged into the brain. Not all animals with a central nervous system have a brain, although the large majority do. Okay, so let's talk about the communication between our neurons. The peripheral nervous system refers to parts of the nervous system outside the brain and spinal cord and includes the cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and their roots and branches of the peripheral nerves and the neuromuscular junctions, the anterior horn, and neuromuscular junctions. Although technically part of the central nervous system, known as CNS, are sometimes discussed with the peripheral nervous system because they are part of the motor unit. So the communication between our neurons. So there's an example of our neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter are made up in the cell body of that neuron and then transported down to the axon terminal. The neurons communicate using both electrical and chemical signals. Sensory stimuli are converted to electrical signals. Action potentials are electrical signals carried taking neurons, and changes in the amount of activity at a synapse can enhance or reduce its function. The communication between neurons is strengthened or weakened by an individual's activities such as exercise, stress, and drug abuse. Our neurons communicate using both electrical and chemical signals, but the changes in the amount of activities at a synapse can enhance or reduce its function. But the synapses are chemical or electrical junctions that allow electrical signals to pass from neurons to other cells.
My name is Kim, and what I will be speaking about today is the embryologic perspective. And I will also be talking about the structures that make up the central nervous system. The nervous system is responsible for controlling much of the body, both voluntary and involuntary functions. The brain is a complex organ composed of white and gray matter, which can be hard to distinguish. So, starting from an embryological perspective allows us to understand how the parts relate to each other. The developing embryo cells belong to one of three germ layers that give rise to the different tissues in the body. The endoderm or inner tissue is responsible for generating the lining inside of our digestive and respiratory systems. The mesoderm or middle tissue gives rise to muscle and connective tissues. The ectoderm or outer tissue develops into skin and the nervous system. As the embryo develops, a portion of the ectoderm differentiates into a specialized region of neuroectoderm, which is the precursor for the tissue of the nervous system. Signals induce cells in this region to differentiate into the neuroepithelium, which forms the neural plate. Neural groove forms visible as a line along the dorsal surface of the embryo. The edges on either side of the neural groove is referred to as the neural fold. These folds come together and converge, forming a tube beneath the ectoderm called the neural tube. So this is going to be the neural tube. Once it converges, it closes up, and then this is where your tube is. Cells from the neural folds then separate from the ectoderm, forming the neural crest, which runs lateral to the neural tube. Not sure if it's okay. So this is the neural crest. Up top is the ectoderm, and the neural tube is still there. The crest migrates away from the embryonic central nervous system that will form along the neural groove and develops into several parts of the peripheral nervous system. The anterior end develops into the brain, and the posterior portion becomes the spinal cord. The anterior end will produce sac-like vessels. Three vessels form at the first stage, which are primary. The proencephalon is the forwardmost vesicle and is translated to mean forebrain. The mesencephalon is the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon is called the hindbrain. These vesicles become 5 secondary vesicles. The proencephalon enlarges into 2 new vesicles called the telencephalon, which later becomes the cerebrum, and the diencephalon, which will become the thalamus and hypothalamus. The rhombencephalon develops into the metencephalon and myelencephalon, collectively the brainstem, which includes the midbrain, pons, and medulla. Okay, so while the brain is developing from the anterior neural tube, the spinal cord is developing from the posterior neural tube. Embryonic development can help in understanding the structures of the adult brain because it establishes a framework on which more complex structures can be built. First, the neural tube establishes the anterior-posterior dimension of the nervous system, which is called the neurax. By standing up, sorry about that. So by standing up and walking on 2 legs, the anterior posterior dimension of the neurax overlays the superior inferior dimension of the body due to a curve between the brainstem and forebrain, which is called the cephalic flexure. Because of this, the neurax starts in an inferior position and ends in an anterior position. Okay, so the front is the reason it ends in this way is so that our eyes and face orientate forward, whereas in our four-legged animal, the neural tube runs anterior to posterior. So because everything is oriented in one smooth line from the skull or the brain straight down to the spine, everything is in one. Whereas in people, when we stand up, there's a curve that happens there. Okay, so the brain and the spinal cord are the central nervous system, which represents the main organs of the nervous system. The gray mantle of the human brain, which appears to make up most of the mass of the brain, is the cerebrum. So this is your entire brain. This is your cerebellum, excluding the cerebellum. All of this is your cerebrum. What I like to think of when I think of the cerebral cortex is kind of like a thin layer covering the cerebrum that is wrinkled. What separates the two sides of the cerebrum is the longitudinal fissure, which this brain, straight ahead, just like me right now, you have your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere, and down the middle is that longitudinal fissure. The white matter of the corpus callosum provides the major pathway for communication between the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. The basal forebrain contains nuclei that are important in learning and memory. The limbic cortex is the region of the cerebral cortex that is a part of the limbic system, which is a collection of structures involved in emotion, memory, and behavior. The cortex can be separated into 4 major lobes, which are your temporal lobe. Your parietal should be right about here. Your occipital is in the back above the cerebellum, and in the front is your frontal lobe. The basal nuclei are responsible for cognitive processing. The basal nuclei in the cerebrum are connected with a few more nuclei in the brain stem that together act as a functional group that form a motor pathway. The major structures of the basal nuclei that control movement are I'm going to butcher these names, caudate, putamen, and globus pallidus. The caudate and putamen are called the striatum. Input to the basal nuclei is from the cerebral cortex, which is an excitatory connection which releases glutamate. Connection releasing glutamate as a neurotransmitter. This input is to the striatum or the caudate and putamen. In the direct pathway, the striatum projects to the internal segment of the globus pallidus, and the GPI or SNR. This is an inhibitory pathway in which GABA is released at the synapses, and the target cells are hyperpolarized and less likely to fire. The output from the basal nuclei is to the thalamus, which is an inhibitory projection using GABA. The diencephalon is the one region of the adult brain that retains its name for the embryologic development. It is the connection between the cerebrum and the rest of the nervous system, with one exception, which is the system associated with the olfaction or the sense of smell, which connects directly with the cerebrum. The diencephalon can be described as any region of the brain with thalamus in it. The thalamus is a collection of nuclei that relay information between the cerebral cortex and the spinal cord or brain stem. The midbrain, which is one of the original regions of the embryonic brain, and the hindbrain, which compose of the pons and the medulla, are collectively referred to as the brain stem. Do I have a picture of that? These are from the textbook, so I don't. But it would be here anyways. Yeah. The cranial nerves connect through the brainstem and provide the brain with sensory input and motor output associated with the head and neck. The medulla is the region also known as the melencephalon in the embryonic brain. The cerebellum is largely responsible for comparing information from the cerebrum with sensory feedback from the spinal cord. Some of the largest neurons of the spinal cord are the multipolar motor neurons in the anterior horn. The fibers that cause contraction of skeletal muscles are the axons of these neurons.
Hello, my name is Mianje, and I'll be discussing section 13.3 about the circulation and central nervous system. The CNS is crucial to the operation of the body. It has a privileged blood supply. It would do anything to protect the body and the brain. That's why it has strict control of what goes in and out of the blood system in the brain. Because anything devastating to cut off the circulation will have devastating results to the brain and severe damages to the human body. Vessels that supply the CNS are called the vertebral arteries. The vertebral arteries enter through the cranium called the foramen, and that's an occipital bone. Then it branches off left and right to the anterior spinal artery. Then that will merge the posterior artery, which will give rise to this picture down here below called the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis provides important communications between the forebrain and the hindbrain. The internal carotid and vertebral basilar systems are used in this process. This will supply, after passing through the CNS, the blood supply runs through the dural sinuses and veins. As you can see above in this picture, the blood circulation will run through the superior sagittal sinus. Then it will absorb the CSF from the meninges, running across the occipital sinus and along the straight sinus. After reaching the straight sinus, it will drain into the transverse sinus. The transverse sinuses connect with the sigmoid sinuses. Then it will connect with the jugular veins, and from there the blood will be circulated back to the heart to be pumped and reoxygenated again. To talk more about the outer surface of the CNS, if you look in this picture, it is covered by a thick layer called the meninge and also the dura mater. They're connective tissues, which are thick layers that will protect the brain. There's also arachnoid matter, which is a thin fibrous layer that holds a sac around the CNS. There's also a pia mater, which is in this picture that fits into the peripheral nervous system. Is all the nerves that lie outside of the CNS, the central nervous system. The primary role of the PNS is to connect the CNS to the skin, limb, and all the organs. The PNS allows the spinal cord and the brain to send and receive messages from the whole body. Axons or bundles of axons, which can be large where you can see by the human eye or small where you have to use a microscope, are called neurons, and this is what the PNS uses to communicate with the body. The somatic system, which is part of the PNS, is responsible for carrying motor and sensory information throughout the body. It contains the motor and sensory neurons. The motor carries information to the spine and to the brain, and this allows for physical movement through the body. Sensory neurons allow us to take sensory information throughout the spine and through the body. In the second part of talking about the peripheral nervous system, we'll be talking about the automatic nervous system. The automatic nervous system is responsible for involuntary movements such as blood flow, heartbeat, digestion, and breathing. It uses two systems, the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system. The parasympathetic system is used after a fight. After a threat has passed, this is when the heart rate will slow down, your breathing will slow down, the blood flow to the muscles will be reduced, and your pupils will not be constricted anymore. The sympathetic system is before the fight. This is called your fight or flight response. It prepares the body for external actions. It prepares for a fight. You'll have an accelerating heart rate, blood flow to the muscles will increase, your pupils will be dilated, and you'll start to sweat even more. This is called fight or flight.